Right, I think we're all here. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the Borsch-Rast lecture for this academic year. The lecture is our graduate and esteemed colleague and friend, Julia Watts Belser, who won the Borsch-Rast Prize in its last competition. We're really delighted to welcome you, Julia, back to the GTU. Some of us have been watching your meteoric career with great admiration for years now. So it's truly a pleasure. We'll also welcome to our conversation Rebecca Parker as a respondent and conversant with Julia. And later on, we will have opportunity, I think, for questions from the audience, which you will be able to send our way. I think we'll do that probably through the chat. So, and you can just post questions there after Julia's presentation and Rebecca's conversation with Julia has ended, and we turn to general questions. So don't crowd the chat yet with questions. I want to just say a couple of things about Julia and Rebecca. Julia is a professor of Jewish Studies in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Georgetown University. She's also involved with the Berkeley Center for Religion at Georgetown and Georgetown's Disability Studies program. She directs a number of projects, including Disability and Climate Change, a public archive project, and is renowned for her work on ancient texts, and particularly Jewish texts, and has enjoyed fellowships, numerous prestigious fellowships at Harvard and the University of Pennsylvania and many other places. She's the author of several books, the most recent of which is, of course, Loving Our Bones, Disability, Wisdom, and Spiritual Subversiveness of Knowing Ourselves Whole, which was published by Beacon in 2023. Julie is also a rabbi, and as those of you who've read her book know, an outspoken advocate for disability and gender justice. So Julia, welcome. It's once again, truly a pleasure for us to welcome you back to the GTU. And it's also a pleasure for us to welcome back Rebecca Parker, who was a beloved member of our community too for many years, and especially as a feminist theologian and as a professor of theology and president of the Starr King School for the Ministry, which some of us feel made a horrible mistake by moving out of the GTU a few years ago. But we live with it. Rebecca is a co-founder of the Braxton Institute for Sustainability, Resiliency, and Joy. She is also the David B. Larson Fellow in Spirituality and Health at the Kluge Center in the Library of Congress. She's written numerous books, including Proverbs of Ashes, Redemptive Suffering and the Search for What Saves Us, and Saving Paradise, How Christianity Traded Love of This World for Crucifixion and Empire, a work that she co-authored with another beloved GTU friend, Rita Nakashimi Brock. Welcome back, Rebecca. I know that the two of you have talked closely about how you would like this to proceed. So I think the best thing for me to do right now is to get out of the way and to turn it over to you, Julia.
Well, thank you so much, Chris, for the warm introduction. And thank you all so much for being here today. It is a huge delight and pleasure and honor to get to return, at least virtually, to the GTU. So I'm a white Jewish woman with curly brown hair, and I'm wearing a textured green jacket. I have a few slides to accompany my talk, so I'm going to go ahead and share those now. All right. So it is, as I said, a deep honor and pleasure to be here with you all today. And I'm really moved to have Loving Our Own Bones recognized with the Borsch-Rast Prize. In so many ways, this book and the seeds of this book were born at the GTU. They were nourished and nurtured by this community and by my teachers here at Starr King, at the Center for Jewish Studies, and elsewhere across Holy Hill. 25 years ago, I came to the Graduate Theological Union hungry for a way to imagine spiritual leadership that would hold the whole of me. I was looking to answer a call to bring disability culture into provocative conversation with Jewish text and tradition, and to braid fierce theological insight with feminist imagination and activist fire. I want to, before I go further, to dedicate my talk today to my beloved teacher, Ibrahim Abdurrahman Farjaje, Zichrono Livracha. May his memory be for a blessing. He taught so many of us to crack our hearts wide open, to ground our work in spiritual conviction, and as he always used to say, to dare to bless the love. I myself come to this work at the intersection of several worlds. I'm a scholar, a cultural historian of disability and gender in rabbinic Jewish literature. I'm a rabbi committed to teaching a Torah of love and liberation, and a Torah that's rooted in the wisdom of queer and feminist and disability communities. And I'm a disability activist, committed to naming and transforming ableism and so many other interlocking patterns of structural violence. I'm committed to building a world where disabled people and where all of us can thrive. So in today's talk, I'll draw out some of the insights from my recent book, Loving Our Own Bones, Disability Wisdom, and the Spiritual Subversiveness of Knowing Ourselves Whole. By disability wisdom, I mean the powerful countercultural work unfolding in disability communities today. The work to honor our actual bodies and minds in all their vibrant complexity. The work to center gentleness and rest, to value spaciousness and care, to refuse that siren song of productivity and instead honor softness and slowness, the ebb and the flow. When I think about disability wisdom, I mean also the work to recognize and resist ableism, all of those systems and attitudes and practices that push disabled people to the margins. So before I go further, I'd like to say a word about what I mean when I talk about disability and ableism. Disability itself is a huge and diverse category. It unfolds in 1,000 different ways. Some disabilities are visible, but the vast majority of disabilities are not apparent at first glance. So whenever I speak about disability, I'm thinking really expansively, I'm thinking about physical disabilities, sensory disabilities, cognitive and intellectual disabilities. I'm thinking about neurodivergence and neurodiversity, mental health disabilities, depression and anxiety, chronic pain, chronic fatigue, long COVID, and many more. Each of these categories I just named, they all unfold like a wild fractal universe. They overlap and blur and fold and change. So when I'm thinking about disability, I'm thinking about body-mind difference. But even more importantly, I'm thinking about the way that difference gets refused. We live in a world that has been set up to accommodate certain kinds of bodies and minds, to offer access to some while pushing others to the margins. That's what I mean when I talk about ableism. Ableism is a complex set of social structures, policies, norms, and attitudes that marginalize people with disabilities and people who are thought to be disabled. Ableism is about power. It's about the way certain bodies and minds get treated as normal, while others get cast as abnormal, deviant, inferior, or undesirable. But I want to be really clear. Ableism isn't just a matter of meanness. It's a matter of structural inequality. When I talk about ableism, I mean concrete, tangible practices that stigmatize disability. I mean systems and structures that deny disabled people access, agency, resources, and self-determination. So by ableism, I mean the low expectations for disabled kids' achievement. I mean the school to prison pipeline. I mean the fact that disabled people are routinely shut out of jobs and turned away from interviews. I mean the fact that disabled parents routinely lose custody of their children, that housing discrimination runs rampant. I mean the fact that disabled people's healthcare access is regularly under assault. Ableism is baked into the way we've built this world. From the physical architecture of our cities, churches, and synagogues, to the basic expectations of our schools and workplaces. All those expectations about time and pace and productivity. All those ways we've chosen to bow before the altar of efficiency. All those ways we make clear whose bodies and minds don't belong. Every disabled person I know has stories about the cost of living in a world that doesn't want us, about being shut out by attitudes, assumptions, and structures that demand everybody's body and mind fit within the same basic norm. This isn't only a disability story. Fat bodies, old bodies, Black and brown bodies, Muslim bodies, Jewish bodies, femme bodies, queer bodies, trans and non-binary bodies. So many of us know the costs that normativity exacts. So there are so many parallels here. I'll be speaking particularly about disability, but I invite you to make connections with your own experience to recognize resonance when and if it unfolds. So in today's talk, I want to lift up a core commitment that I see at the heart of disability culture, a fierce and unabashed commitment to insisting on the worthiness, the brilliance, the value of disabled people's lives in the face of a world that so often treats us like trash. I name that work as sacred. That conviction that we can forge new ways of making family and practicing care, that we can help each other learn to spit out poison, to release the barbs that ableism sinks into our mind and flesh, that conviction that we all deserve a world that welcomes us, that we can and must transform patterns of exclusion and violence and disdain. That's sacred work. It is the most sacred work I know. So in my talk today, I want to lift up how thinking with disability wisdom can reshape how we read the sacred texts of our religious traditions, and how it can spur us to confront violence and tangle with injustice. I want to lay out why I think it matters for religious communities to recognize disability as a justice issue, why it matters to build political solidarity with disabled people as a way of living out core spiritual commitments. And finally, I'll argue that disability wisdom can be a potent provocation for theology, that disability can crack open new ways of thinking about divine presence and power, that it can shiver something new and vital into the ways we name and know God. So let's start by looking at a biblical text, a difficult text, right? So fair warning, if you need to brace yourself up, this is a text that calls us to grapple with some really deep roots of disability exclusion. The text is Leviticus 21:17. It's a biblical text that declares that a priest with a blemish may not bring sacrifice to God. The full biblical passage lays out in precise detail all of the different kinds of priests who are not allowed to serve. No one who is blind, no one who is lame, no priests of short stature, no priests with a limb that is too short or too long, no priest with scurvy, no priest with boil scars or once broken arms. Anyway, the list goes on and on and on. The ideal priest is one who has what disability studies theorist Rosemary Garland Thompson calls the privilege of visual anonymity. Bodies that stand out are imagined here, as biblical scholars Jeremy Schipper and Jeffrey Stackert have shown, as aberrations whose nonconformity is imagined to disturb the divine gaze. So this is a profoundly troubling text, not just for the way that it portrays God as preferring a certain kind of normative body, but also for the way that it bars disabled priests from the most sacred duties of their position. Priests with a blemish are still priests, but they are forbidden to bring sacrifice. And most painful of all, our passage concludes with words that forbid blemished priests from entering the sacred places, from drawing near to God's own altar. The language here is really terrible. It says, lest they profane God's own sanctuary. So I ask us to tarry here. I ask us to look this pain in the face. Because we live in a world that deals this kind of violence unflinching. We live in a world that tells so many of us that our bodies and minds are defective, that we are undesirable, that we're a desecration. Now that is a lie, but it is a lie with teeth, a lie that is being told this very day to disabled people, to people who are chronically ill, to trans people, to queer folk, to Black and brown and Indigenous people, to women, to elders, to poor people, to people who are unhoused, to immigrants, to refugees. Now I want to be clear. I take it as absolute bedrock that God loves each one of us fiercely. I know in my bones that God relishes the presence of sick, mad, deaf, and disabled people on this earth. We are beloved and wanted and cherished. So I will never believe that Leviticus 21 tells us anything true about God's own feeling. But I do believe this text tells us quite a lot about how humans judge each other and how quick we are to press our prejudices onto God. In this first part of my talk today, I want to trace two ways that classical Jewish commentators have read Leviticus 21. As we'll see, Jewish tradition grapples with this difficult text in bold and significant ways. The rabbis don't like it either. Right? The rabbis work to limit disability exclusion and to recognize the impact of disability stigma. But they also reinscribe one of the most painful power dynamics of ableism, the demand that disabled people tamp down our difference and fit ourselves into a non-disabled norm. So let's take a look at the work of Moses Maimonides, a brilliant 13th century Jewish philosopher. Maimonides takes up Leviticus 21 in the Guide for the Perplexed, where he asks about the reason for the commandment in Leviticus 21. Right? It's an amazing passage because Maimonides assumes that God cannot possibly care about the prettiness of a priestly face, or be invested in the straightness of a priest's spine. So given that, right, why then does the Torah include this commandment? That's the question Maimonides is grappling with. So Maimonides understands this as a moment of divine accommodation to the worst parts of human nature. God knows that humans are inclined to judge each other. So he says, the multitude does not assess a person on the basis of his true form, but on the wholeness of his limbs and the beauty of his garments. It's because of that tendency, Maimonides asserts, that God lays down this exclusion in order to make sure that no one disparages the holy temple or the priests who serve there. Now, there's something powerful about Maimonides' claim, something that matters to me deeply. Maimonides reframes the nature of this prohibition. He says, it's not God that dislikes disabled priests. The problem is the rest of us do. And so that's a powerful flip. But as much as I appreciate Maimonides' insistence that God's feeling isn't actually the source of this prohibition, I want us to also name and notice the violence that remains. Maimonides claims that disabled priests can't serve at the altar because other people might mock us, because the multitudes, the masses, don't recognize our worth. But notice how it's the disabled priest who gets sidelined, so the honor of the temple can be preserved. I name this here and now because I want to call our attention to the way that religious communities so often double down on decorum, the way respectability and propriety get fashioned into a signal mark of sanctity. The tendency to prize nice, neat bodies all lined up in a row. A very similar dynamic unfolds in the Mishnah, a 2nd century rabbinic Jewish text that's a really foundational cornerstone for Jewish law and practice. For the rabbis in the Mishnah, the core question that Leviticus 21 poses is no longer about temple sacrifice. The temple has already been destroyed. So they transfer this question to the synagogue. They ask, who is allowed to come before the congregation? Who can offer God's blessing to the people? The core ritual gesture for making the blessing is a practice of lifting up the hand. So in this text, Mishnah Megillah 4:7, the rabbis assert a priest whose hands are blemished may not lift up his hands. That is to say, he may not come before the community and offer the blessing. Now, there's a curious detail in our Mishnah, though, a quite tantalizing phrase. One of the rabbis, Rabbi Yehuda, says a priest whose hands are stained with woad or madder, those are blue or red dyes, he also can't lift up his hands to offer a blessing. And even more importantly, Rabbi Yehuda says why. He says, because the people might stare. And if they stare, they'll get distracted by those hands, and then they'll miss the full force of the blessing. Now, in some ways, this could have been a really powerful moment. This could have been a moment that recognizes the problem isn't the body of the priest, right? The problem isn't the disabled body or the different body. The problem is the social disruption of the stare. Here's what I wish. I wish this text had been a moment where the rabbis checked the force of the non-disabled gaze. I wish they had used this as a reminder to reckon with the fact of difference, to manage our own distractibility, to ask us to turn away from relentless judgment and scrutiny of anything, any body, any mind that strikes us somehow as strange. But none of that happens. Instead, faced with the dilemma of distraction, the Mishnah solves the problem by making the disabled priest disappear. A few centuries later, the Babylonian Talmud takes up the Mishnah's teaching and lays out a legal principle that remains influential in Jewish practice to this day. It considers 3 cases where a priest who should have been disqualified was still invited to bless. It asks, what's going on? And it concludes that if a person is well known in a particular town, or if his condition is commonplace, then the priest is permitted to bless. Okay? So what the rabbis are saying, in other words, is familiarity diffuses the stare. On its face, this is such a powerful moment, right? It is an incredibly inclusive gesture. As soon as you become known, you're no longer prohibited from offering the blessing. But here's the thing I want to ask us. Here's the thing that haunts me. Whose responsibility is it to become familiar? All too often, it's disabled people who are forced to bear the burden of embracing normativity. We're the ones expected to make ourselves more palatable to the non-disabled gaze. There are 1,000 ways we learn to do this, to shear away distinctiveness, to disavow our difference, to apologize for our complexity, to pass, to cover, to shrink, to hide. I'm thinking of all the hours we've spent trying to hide our limps or train away our stutters, to align our body minds with neurotypical norms and expectations, to sit still, to keep quiet, to look them in the eye. I am thinking of everyone I know who has learned to veil the full force of their depression or their chronic pain in so many spaces, in so many ways. There's this expectation that disabled people must tame our differences, that we must present only the most palatable version of ourselves for public view. It doesn't have to be like this. We could take the Talmud's principle of familiarity and turn it on its head. We could insist that the obligation to become familiar lies with the community. We could expect this of our schools, our seminaries, our workplaces, our cultural spaces, our churches, our mosques, our temples, our synagogues. We could insist that it's our communities that have a sacred obligation to grapple with the force of this command, to take difference seriously, to learn the nuance of different access needs, and to shift the burden back where it belongs. Because the truth is, friends, when I think about the most transformative moments of disability culture, I think about the fierce, feral dreaming disabled folks do when we get the world's tight-pressed norms off our backs, when we strip away the confines and make our own wild magic. I want the live wire brilliance that disability can bring to spiritual life and to religious community. Now, of course, I want to be really clear here. Brilliance isn't required of any of us. Disabled people deserve a world where we can show up tired and weary, where we can be irritable about our body minds or anything else. We deserve access even when we aren't particularly interesting, when we aren't somehow transformative. It's no one's obligation to be a catalyst for spiritual revolution. We deserve communities that hold us even when we don't have anything to give. So when I talk about what disability can bring to religious community, I don't mean disabled people are required to carry yet another thing. I mean, I want us to leave ourselves open to the subversive power of disability as both embodied reality and cultural provocation. I mean, I want what happens when we let disability spur us to think differently about theology, to crack open stale preconceptions about divine presence and power, to imagine also a God who knows disability from the inside. I mean, I want what unfolds when we let the sizzle of disability culture seep into the way we think about the sacred. I want us to let the hard-won knowledge disabled folks carry about how to love hard and fight fierce in a world that devalues us. I want that knowledge to shake up what we think we know about solidarity and risk and vulnerability and care. I want that as a crucible and catalyst for theological imagination. I like to think about theology as a grammar of the imagination. And so I want to let the juiciness of disability wisdom help us feel and dream and imagine something new. So let me tell you a story about what I mean. It's a story of unexpected recognition, a story of finding God in the mirror of my own flesh. It was years ago now on the Jewish holiday of Shavuot, the day Jews celebrate the giving of the Torah, the gift of revelation. In synagogue that morning, I heard the reader chant the ancient words of the prophet Ezekiel, the Hebrew prophet who had an extraordinary vision, not actually of God, God's self, but of God's immense chariot and its huge, brilliant, shimmering wheels. It was electric, that moment. It shivered down my spine, this delicious, true, deep knowing God has wheels. Ezekiel sees God in a radiant fire, borne on a vast chariot, lifted up by four weirdly beautiful angelic creatures with fused legs, lustrous wings, and great wheels. It's the wheels that he lingers with, the wheels he can't get enough of. The biblical text is so lush with wheel love. The wheels gleam like beryl, he says. They are wheels within wheels. And then this verse that feels like it was written just for me. Ezekiel says, the living spirit is in the wheels. What can I tell you about this moment of kinship? How can I invite you into that joy of bone deep connection and recognition, that sense that God knows something I love? To make that moment come alive, I have to give you a glimpse into my own embodied life as a wheelchair user. The joy I feel, the things I savor, the fluid, sensual pleasure of rolling down a smooth, gentle grade, the way I can lean into a curve and feel the ground flow back into my body, the twin vibration of earth and wheel. This is how the holy moves through me, this intricate interplay of muscle and spin. So as I think about God on wheels, there's two things I want to lift up here, theologically and ethically. First, I want to lift up the potency of God on wheels as a way of claiming disability joy. I believe there is something radical and revolutionary in the art and act of saying yes to our own bones. I believe that it matters religiously and spiritually when we center the knowledge of our own pleasure and when we say yes to the savory. I say that now, especially in these days of profound violence and assault, when so many of our bodies and minds are under threat. We live in a world that wants to shrink us, but I want our lives to be as wide as the sky. It matters to claim joy, to kindle it, to nourish it, to share it, to speak of it in our sacred spaces, to let it bathe our minds, our bodies, our breath, our bones, to let it cradle us. It is from this place, this deepest place of true knowing, this fierce-rooted core of luminous, potent, revolutionary love, that I do my most meaningful work for life, for justice, for the world in which I still believe. I want us to linger for a moment with the words of Black lesbian feminist Audre Lorde, who wrote so incisively about the power of finding and claiming the deepest sources of our joy. Once we touch that joy, Lorde writes, once we know its possibility, it becomes a grave responsibility, not to settle for the convenient, the shoddy, the conventionally expected, nor the merely safe. Joy is a catalyst. Joy is a force for political imagination. Joy is fuel for the fight. Because here's the other thing I know. To move through the world on wheels is not always a pleasure. It isn't all bliss. So here's the second thing I want to name about the political and theological, ethical potency of God on wheels. I think it can help us see how God has an access problem. If God wheels through this world, then God knows the sharp frustration of wheelchair life, the building with no elevator, the bus with a perpetually broken lift, the curb without a cut, the set of steps in front of the closest grocer, the church with no accessible place to pee. Thinking about how God gets shut out puts a different spin on a classic religious problem. Spiritual seekers so often lament how hard it is to find God in this world. Divine presence so often feels elusive. So often I hear us asking, where is God? Where is God? How can we get close? To think of God on wheels, for me, flips that problem on its head. Maybe God can't get close to us because of all the barriers we've fashioned, all the norms and habits we've allowed to shape our days. When I think of God on wheels, I think God knows what it's like to make a long and lonely trace of the perimeter, to go round and round a building, searching for one accessible route inside. God knows the locked lift when the key can't be found. God knows the haggling and the negotiations at the door. God knows the longing and the giving up, the slow trudge home. I mean this as a metaphor, of course, but metaphor is tactile. Metaphor is true. When I think of God on wheels, I think of all the ways I shut God out. Most days it's not a conscious choice. It's a wall built out of 1,000 rushed decisions and the weight of other pressing obligations. Right? It's those slipshod shortcuts, the locked doors I don't even notice. Maybe the question we need to ask is not, where is God, but how have we shut God out? And can we break those patterns? Can we refashion our own inner and outer architecture can we crack open all those habits and patterns that keep the holy at bay? Of course, maybe even more importantly, it's not just God who we shut out of our sanctuaries. Recognizing God on wheels puts access at the very center of our spiritual work. And I don't just mean access for wheelchair users. Disability unfolds in 1,000 different ways, and access looks different for all of us. When I talk about centering access, I mean a commitment to thinking broadly and boldly. I mean sensory access and cognitive access, braille, sign language, captions, language access, quiet space and cushions and softness for our bones. I mean flexible schedules with rest days built in. I mean remote access and hybrid community. I mean the 1,000 tangible practices that enact solidarity and mutuality and justice and care. I mean a recognition that our bodies and minds deserve ease and gentleness, that we deserve communities that want us, that desire us, even when it's complicated, especially when it's complicated. These are hard days. These are hard days, and so many of us are living on the edge and living in fear. I want to tell you how much it matters that religious communities recognize disability as a justice issue, that religious communities, that all of us take up the call to confront ableism, to refuse both spiritually and politically the assault on disabled people's lives. We are living in a moment where the life and safety and fundamental well-being of disabled people is under profound attack. If Medicaid is defunded, millions of disabled people will lose access to healthcare and to the in-home supports and services people need to live in our own homes and communities. Medicaid is a lifeline for so many people I love, friends and comrades, activists and artists, my colleagues, families, my neighbors' kids. And it's not just healthcare at risk. We are losing the basic fundamental protections that give disabled people a fighting chance to access education, that give us frameworks to push back against discrimination. So much is being dismantled. So much is being destroyed. When I talk about God on wheels, I'm talking about a God who knows that vulnerability from the inside. When I'm talking about God on wheels, I'm talking about a God who anchors my conviction that we can and must challenge the systems that disenfranchise us. I want us to commit to bold political work for fair housing and employment access, for health equity and reproductive justice, for climate justice that recognizes disabled people's disproportionate risk, for peace, for an end to militarism, for a total transformation of our immigration system, for racial justice, for reparations, for abolition, for an end to incarceration. It is a spiritual practice, a justice practice, to work for a world where disabled people can thrive. But the power of theology, I think, is not just that it catalyzes our work in the world. It's also that theology can crack open our imaginations. Theology calls us toward new ways of feeling and knowing. It can tune us toward possibilities we hadn't yet dared to dream. So at the very end of Loving Our Own Bones, I write about how much it matters to me to know and name God on wheels and to recognize God in this way through the mirror of my own flesh. But God on wheels is just one glimpse of holy possibility, one sliver of the extraordinary diversity of disability experience and theological possibility. When I think about God on wheels, I'm also thinking about a deaf God, about a God with Down syndrome. I ask myself what a blind God knows, how an autistic God perceives this world, what she unfolds about the nature of the sacred, and how she might invite us to encounter the infinite. I want to know the sacred through 1,000 disabled languages and revel in the holy silence of a non-speaking God's heart. I've been thinking these days quite a lot about a non-speaking God, in part because I have learned so much from non-speaking friends and activists about the way our world privileges those of us like me who have swift, easy access to words upon words upon words. I've been thinking these days about a non-speaking God and what they know about the underside of power, the way this world so often runs roughshod over non-speaking people's agency, the way it must burn to have one's competence denied over and over again. I've been thinking about how a non-speaking God might help us to reimagine revelation as a dissident speech practice, as an act that breaks through facile fluency. I've been thinking about what I've learned from friends and beloveds who communicate through letterboards and text-to-speech tools, about the time it takes to communicate through these means, about the effort involved, about the way communication costs. I'm thinking about what it might mean to recognize God knows these barriers from the inside. I'm thinking about the way so many speech devices come built with pre-programmed scripts, the way choice gets circumscribed by other people's assumptions about what you might want to say. I'm thinking about the creativity it takes to work within constraints, to craft a poem, to articulate anger, to crack a joke, to honor grief. I am thinking about the hard-won expertise that non-speaking people carry, the cleverness and fight it takes to navigate a world that is intent on erasing you. And I want to learn what that might tell us about the potency and ingenuity of God's own word in the world. The way revelation bursts through cracks and crevices, the way it shatters hierarchy and upends our notions of value, the way silence blooms like a promise, like overlooked possibility, like the breath that rustles the deep. I want to build a world with you. A world where disabled people have the tools, the resources, the access we need to draw out these possibilities and 1,000 more. A world where we know the wholeness and the rightness of our being. A world where we feel it reflected back like a mirror, like a brilliance, like a balm. I want to build a world with you. A world that knows God thrums like a bass line in the ache of every body, in the tenderness, in the stretch of every wing, the curl of every hand, in the burn scars, in the birthmarks, in the marrow of the bone. I want to build a world with you. A world that knows the thing we thought we had to hide might be the best beloved. The thing they told us was our flaw might be our brilliance and our beauty. I want to build a world with you. A world that welcomes us, a world that wants the very quirkiness that ableism would outlaw, a world that savors neurodiversity, that sees our singularity as a witness to infinity. I want to build that world with you, a world that prizes us, a world that will embrace us, a world that celebrates and cradles us, a world that wants us here, a world that desires us. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you for opening our minds. I'm now going to invite Rebecca, and this is challenging my technological ability here. So just give me a moment to.
Sure, no problem.
I'm
No
so
problem.
sorry. To get myself in order.
It's great. I'll just take a breath too. It's good. It's nice.
Please do. Why am I not finding you, Rebecca?
I don't know. Can you hear me, Chris?
I can hear you.
So,
So,
it's
but I'm.
spotlight function. It may be that the ASL folks need to do the spotlighting.
No, I think it's still Chris.
It's still Chris?
I think it's still Chris.
Still me, but I
He has
think
the power.
you
Chris
are
has
here.
power.
You are. Yeah, but as usual, I'm not quite sure how to exercise it. The
It's because you're a Presbyterian.
there you are.
There we go. Such a true story for the moment, right? It's a really poignant question, how to exercise the power that we do have.
True. That's so true. And I found you for a second and now I lost you again, Rebecca. I'm gonna I don't know why I'm not seeing you. Goodness.
Take your time.
Rebecca, could you try talking again?
All
There
right.
you are. Sorry. Okay, now I
I'm-
found you.
I'm
Okay,
talking
there we
again.
go.
Uh-huh.
Oh, there you are, Rebecca.
Let me get out of
Okay.
the way.
Wonderful.
All right. Good. Thank you, Chris. And Julia, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the beauty and the power of your words and the beautiful flow of images that gave even more dimension to your insights and ways for us to receive and integrate what you're sharing and bringing to us. It's an honor to be here at the Graduate Theological Union virtually with you today, with you, Chris, and old friends and new. Good to be together. Time is not linear. It circles like a wheel. This moment now certainly circles round to embrace the presence of our beloved friend and co-conspirator in revolutionary theology, Ibrahim Farajajeh. Peace be upon him. And it circles back to 25 years ago, Julia, when you and I were together at Star King. We were working to counter theologies that sanctified violence and to reimagine love. Thank you for giving us so many ways to understand and to experience wheels. Turning and turning and turning, you show us, creates new knowledge that comes about also Sankofa-like by returning and turning things around. You turn around sacred texts, asking us, does this passage tell us the truth about God, or is it rather exposing the truth about humanity, about our limited ability to be with difference without constraining and oppressing the different? You turn God around from being the all-powerful male, omniscient potentate who disdains imperfections, to one who suffers being shut out by human barriers that block God's desire to reach us. You introduce God on wheels in your brilliant, illuminating read of Ezekiel's vision of the wheels. You turn disability around, upending the disparagements, the benevolent paternalism and supremacy of ableism, and instead, as you've done so beautifully here today, affirm the power and capacities of disability in all its diversities and divergencies. You teach us that disability carries its own particular joys, its own revolutionary imagination and life wisdom. You are clear that while there is assuredly no obligation for the disabled to share their gifts to benefit those who are ableist, still you graciously make space for those of us who are temporarily able-bodied to turn around and remove barriers in our hearts and our minds so that we can receive what you have named disability wisdom and spiritual subversiveness. Listening to you, I remember the first time I began to experience this turnaround, this transforming turnaround. One day in chapel at Star King School, the service was led entirely by members of the deaf community. There was poetry in sign, prayer in sign, music and ritual in sign. An interpreter kindly translated some of the sign language into spoken word for those of us who were sign language impaired. The tables were turned and the power shifted. And when you described the pleasure of rolling around a curve on a slight downhill in your chair, something I have not known, I could feel it. And the delight you describe made me happy too. Such openings as these are gifts of grace for those of us whose ignorance has aided and abetted the strictures of ableism, and such openings, hopefully, will help build that world you speak of, which knows God on wheels in the ache of every body, in the tenderness, in the stretch of every wing. Thank you for all this spin, for all these revolutions. Your lecture sparked many thoughts for me, and I'd like to have some conversation with you about a few of them. Let's start with the deep theological theme present in Judaism and Christianity that speaks of humanity created in the image of God. B'Tselem Elohim for Jewish theology, Imago Dei theology for Christians. You speak to the value of this theology for resisting injustice and oppression and for reimagining God. But you also pay attention to the limits of this theology. I invite you to talk to us some more about the importance of this theological theme, but also the limits that you begin to address in the later part of Loving Our Own Bones.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you for the beautiful response and for all of the ways that you have named the different powers of revolution and the wheels, right? The spin of the work. That's so resonant. And I appreciate that, especially with this question that you've opened up about the idea of B'Tselem Elohim, or the idea of humans being made in God's image. I want to say at the outset that, of course, this is a very potent piece of theological work that has often been used to ground really important work in the world. So I think about the ways that so often disability rights work, human rights work, anti-torture work, immigration work has appealed to this concept. So I deeply appreciate that. And also, at the same time, when I look more closely at the history of the way in which both Jewish and Christian interpreters have understood this idea of what it means and who gets to be seen as made in the image of God, who's B'Tselem Elohim, it has often actually also been used for exclusionary purposes. It's been used to reinforce the idea that some bodies and some minds are closer to God than others. I think, there's a way in which this kind of theological thinking can end up reinscribing a certain vision of what Rosemary Garland Thompson calls the normate, right? Or that idea, that sort of mythical idea of the normal everyday body, right? And also the way it can be used to reinforce patterns of privilege, right? But B'Tselem Elohim and this idea of divine image has often been used to reinforce the idea that, of course, God is male, right? And of course, men should have power in religious communities. I mean, it works both ways, as feminist theologians have been so incisive for illuminating. There's a whole racist history here to the way in which this idea of divine image, in its most meager, constricted sense, has been sometimes deployed. The whole idea of human superiority over other animals, which is such a terrible theological claim that has so many devastating ecological impacts and climate change impacts, that's also grounded in this idea of, oh, humans are superior to the beasts, right? All of that ends up resting on the idea of the idea that humans have special attributes, some particular special attributes. And of course, those are often the very things that end up leaving disabled people out. Oh, we can speak. Oh, we can walk. Oh, we can stand. So it's just so tiresome. I think I find myself just really, I think that's one of the reasons that when I just am not so interested in going to the generic image, but actually really drawn toward the radical particularity of 1,000 different images. That, I think, feels to me like a safer way to know something about God's divine image, that it's never singular, that it always has to be reflected in and through all of us. And again, I mean, not just humans, but all creation.
Let me respond to that with a couple of things that were really sparked for me by what you're talking about. And your work and how you work with the sacred texts. You made me remember the way we have to look for the shards and the fragments and the bits and pieces of the non-monolithic ways of speaking about God, or the ways of speaking about God we can find in our traditions that really open up to this pluralism.
Yeah, yeah.
And one of the places I cherish in the New Testament is when Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, the 15th chapter, struggles to explain to people why they could believe that God has the creative power to raise the dead and or bring new life where there has been, say, the tragedy of crucifixion or violation. And to explain this, he starts talking about the multiplicity of bodies, of different kinds of bodies. He says, there are many kinds of bodies. And the bodies that there are change. So for example, the seed, when you plant it in the ground, it transforms into another body. And then he says there are earthly bodies and celestial bodies. And he says the moon, and these bodies have beauty. He said the moon has one kind of beauty, and the sun, another beauty. And the stars, another beauty. And each star even differs from the other star in beauty. And then he says, not all earthly bodies are the same. Human flesh has one body, kind of body, and animals, another, and fish, another, and the winged creatures of the air, still another. So this is his argument for the creative transforming power of the divine, is the observation of the diversity of bodies. And so I come back to that, the authority of that text, to ground disability theology, anti-racism theology, so many important. And there too, in response to what you just said, he's not only Paul, who we often try to discard, but every now and then he says something marvelous. Paul is also speaking about all the different earthly and heavenly bodies that are not human.
Yeah.
So God is creating, God is the creative transformer and maker of multiplicities of bodies, all of which are beautiful and are signs of God. I think about how in the Quran, the celestial bodies are often invoked as signs of God.
It's so beautiful to me.
So beautiful. So I mean, I go on and on, but this, what you just said about turning to the beyond the human, touches on one of the other themes that runs throughout loving our own bones, and it was only just touched on a little bit in your lecture today, and that is your love for the natural world, for woods, for mountains, for birds. You love to go hiking in your chair. Your sensitivity to the intricate interdependence of all things, and your own activism on behalf of the earth. And then you make revelatory connections between disability theology and ecology.
Thanks, Rebecca.
So say a little more about that, and then and I want to share a little about Rachel Carson, who I know is important to you, but please talk more about disability theology and ecology.
One of my favorite lines in Loving Our Own Bones is, the dolphin's God has a dorsal fin. Right? The sense that it's not just humans who see ourselves reflected in 1,000 different ways in the divine image, but also that the divine image is reflective of, expressive of the intricacy, the brilliance, the splendor, the magnificence, the weird, wonderful strangeness of the non-human world as well. And that's actually become a seed for a new project that I'm working on, which is thinking very much with disability, theology, ecology, and the non-human world, thinking particularly about what I like to call God of crows. Thinking about how crows, these often maligned sometimes despised. I mean, I know, Rebecca, because we had a chat about this, that you and I both love them and think they're marvelous, right? But they get a kind of bad rap in a lot of circles. People are often very spooky about crows, describe them as birds of bad repute or bad omens or things like that. I'm so drawn to them that because of that kinship with disability, actually, the way in which their bodies are also projected on all the time.
Mhm.
But when I think theologically, one of the things that's really been interesting for me is about imagining and understanding God as radically beyond the human, as reflecting also, sharing also in the knowledge that crows have.
Mm.
And I think for me, this has been really potent. I mean, I've come to this in part through disability theology, because it was disability theology that helped me understand that. I mean, it connects right back to what I was saying about the non-human, like the non-speaking God, that speech is not required for presence, revelation, meaning. Like, why should we? I mean, it's such a speaker's hubris, right? To
Mhm.
assume that everybody does, right? And God, right? God, the great, right? Does things just like we do? No. So there's something about the work of disability theology for me that's about inhabiting dissident social positions and experiences, these spaces, these lived embodied experiences, these ways of working with bodies and minds that are so often maligned and despised, that has just opened up a really, I think, wide door into all of the presumptions that we place onto what, the sort of assumptions we make about what God can do, must do, who God is in the world, what God looks like. I mean, it's funny. Jewish theology is not at all into the idea of imaging God. And yet people are always very clear, right? That if God, I mean, Jewish theology by and large disclaims the idea that God has a body. And yet people are always very clear that if God did have a body, it surely wouldn't limp. Right. And so it's that tension that I'm really interested in thinking more about.
This uh, this notion of all the other ways that creativity and revelation and transformation, divine activity happens beyond speaking, um, hearing, exercising the strong right hand, all these ways that God is imagined in the scriptures.
What about the left hand? I always want to
The
ask
left
about the
hand,
left hand,
yeah,
right?
right. The
As
left
somebody
hand,
with left side weakness, I'm
yeah,
really into the idea of the other, right?
yeah,
The
left hand,
non-strong, the non-dominant hand.
yeah, and we have occasionally in the sacred scriptures of Judaism and Christianity these notions that things other than God are going to speak metaphorically. So the stones are going to cry out, the wind will speak, the earth itself will speak, and you and I share a love for Rachel Carson, who I'm researching right now in my work at the Library of Congress on eco-spirituality. And coming back to Rachel Carson and learning again how incredible the newness of her thinking was about ecological connectedness among all creatures, and how no creature could be understood as biology traditionally did, kind of by just studying the one creature. You had to see the creature in their environment, in the relationship to the other creatures, in their relationship to the seasons and time. So all this intricate diversity, and then she was so concerned that human beings were failing to love these realities. And even so much of the ecological movement is about how human beings need all these things. We need the beauty of the mountains, rather than, but what you're pointing towards is the intrinsic value of the things in themselves.
Yeah.
They have their own life, their own value, their own relationship to God and God's relationship to them. I love that. But, and then one of the things I did not know about Rachel Carson is that when she was writing Silent Spring, she herself was dying of cancer, quite possibly induced by her own exposure to pesticides. And she was doing all the things like you're doing now, going around making lectures and advocating for things. But she hid her weakened state, and she was living with extreme pain, which put her into a wheelchair. But she always told even her friends, oh, she was fine. She just had a little bout of arthritis, because she was afraid that if people saw her disability, they would use it to discredit her advocacy around all the rest of creation. They'd say it was just personal, it was just her personal need that was making her say what she was saying. And I feel such gratitude to her, and then also this heartbreak. It makes me of the denial that what she cloaked, the mask she wore, to maintain her authority. And this also makes me wonder about the kind of denial that the denial about climate change, the things that make the privileges of humanity difficult to face into.
Yeah.
So you talked about how hard these times are now, and the importance of joy. And could you say some more about that, the importance of finding ways to contend right now in a world that is putting so much of what we love under attack, and that is despising, that's making diversity, equity, and inclusion illegal, unfundable, has to be wiped out, and all the lives that's harming.
Yeah.
Tell us a little more.
Yeah.
This is
I'm
my last
thinking
question to
about
you.
this in so many ways, the way that, what's coming to my mind as you name this, Rebecca, is that powerful refrain that I first learned from the immigration justice community: no human being is illegal, right?
It's illegal.
No human being is illegal.
Yeah.
And I think that when I think about grounding myself in conviction, rooting in conviction, and then feeding that also with joy, that's one of the places that I go, right? The knowing that disability culture has taught me that just because the world tries to tell you that your life is wrong, that your body is wrong, that you don't deserve to exist, right? The world tells us 1,000 lies.
Mm.
And of course, it often has the power to back them up with force, with denial of funding, with all sorts of, the story that you told about Rachel Carson knowing that she needed to hide her own disability because of ableism, because it would discredit her work. And that's one of the stories that I think illuminates the costs.
Mm-hmm.
But I find myself returning, there's like a gentle but firm as iron fist in my heart that says, the love that we kindle for each other and for ourselves and for this sweet earth, it matters. It matters. It is the most powerful resistance that we have. It is what reminds us that, I mean, when I think about the power of empire, it is both incredibly violent and so strong, and also so brittle, so incredibly scared. So I've been thinking a lot about crows and their survival strategies, right? These, in part because when I find myself in a space of despair, I go out, I spend time with the birds.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that I love about those birds is that part of what they have done is to hack a world that was not made for them and figured out how to make these incredibly intense urbanized human altered spaces, these kinds of climate ruined spaces. They've figured out ways to make them work. They are so adaptive, they're so clever, not in terms of like book smarts, but in terms of like, all right, how am I gonna go underground, weave around, figure out a way, make it work. You take your trash and use it. And I think about that also as a disability survival skill. I mean, disability is a masterclass in adaptation. Disabled people know so much about navigating a world that was not built for us, that was not designed for us, and that is often trying to kill us. So I don't want to romanticize that knowledge. Like, that's hard-won knowledge, and we should not have had to learn it. But given that we have had to learn it, I am drawn toward what might be learned and gained from rooting down into those places and to inviting the wisdom, the grief, the hope, the yearning, the resolve that comes from really deeply marginalized communities. Of course, not just by, I mean, I'm thinking about the way in which this knowledge is held by so many different minoritized, marginalized communities. I've learned so much from Black and Brown communities, from queer communities, from feminist communities. I mean, there's so many ways in which this expertise is held in the world. And I want us to, yeah, to learn it, to listen to it. And I mean, one of those pieces of knowledge is fight hard and love hard, right? Like, take joy wherever you can. I think that also really, really matters. Don't let them steal our joy.
Don't let them steal our joy. So dare to bless the crows, dare to
Yeah.
dare to bless the joy, dare to bless the love, dare to bless the divergent, the weird, the different, the disabled. Dare to bless. So Chris, Julia, I think we're coming practically to the end of our time, and Chris promised a little opening up for questions. So let us stop our conversation here and see what Chris would have happen now.
Well, I think we might barely have time for one question from the audience. So I'll just ask if any of you would like to take advantage of this offer, you can use the raise hand feature. If you click on React at the bottom of your screen, and I will recognize you. But you will need to act quickly.
Well, I'm loving this. Several of you are sending me messages about crows and crow facts and crow studies. This is making me so joyful. Thank you very, very much. I love that, and I love that that project is resonating with
great.
you. So that's
Really,
awesome.
Julia, since no one is asking, I'd love to ask you a
Yeah,
small
go for it.
kind of technical question. I know I'm not the only one who really admired your use of art in your presentation. What was so clear about that is that you were selecting pieces that not only didn't merely illustrate what you said, but interpreted what you said and kind of offered a visual complement that created a certain kind of conversation. I wondered if maybe you'd like, in closing, to reflect very briefly on how you think about art as a form of both a source of theological knowledge and a form of expression.
Thanks. Such a beautiful question. I love working with art in this way. And so, two things I'll say. So, first, I think of the slides as a mode of access support for folks who are visually oriented and who appreciate having some follow along. So, the slides, as you know, have both visual art and also like pull quotes from the talk. And I am very thoughtful about what I want to put text-wise on the slides, but also the pairing with the art. I'd say the art is meant to be evocative. I'm particularly looking for art that feels like it is inviting sighted viewers into an engagement with the feeling.
Mm,
So
mm,
they're meant to like hopefully crack open, widen some other possibility, right? I think a lot about how to convey the kind of love I have and appreciation I have for disability culture. And for those who don't necessarily know that from the inside, I think I try to find art that feels like it's bringing some of that alive. And then for folks who do know it from the inside, it's also sort of like I hope, a balm of like, oh yeah, oh
mm,
yeah.
mm,
I'd say the art is about roughly 50% done by artists who are disability identified, and then there's some artists whose identities I know less about, but I was drawn to their work. I found it potent or and inviting. I think that that image of cracking open that I use to think about disability and theology is also something that I experience with art. The same way I found working with disabled artists and disabled performers, the work of disabled dancers, to be another really provocative way of thinking, even though that's often deeply secular work, not explicitly engaged with religion. I find something really sacred about it, really potent. And so bringing that deliberately into my theological work is part of one of the methods um, that I use. I think art gives us a way of ways into feeling and sensing and dreaming that we might not otherwise find.
So well said. That is the end of our time. Um, Julia, sometimes in my office, I get to be terribly presumptuous, and it feels presumptuous to say, um, we are so proud of you at the GTU, and it's presumptuous because you know what you've achieved on your own, and it was just our privilege to be walking beside you or rolling beside you along the way. So thank you so much for the work that you do. And Rebecca, thank you for creating this fabulous conversation that we've all enjoyed. And thank you, Christina and Sarah, for adding American Sign Language interpretation and translation. We appreciate that very much, which for the sighted among us added actually another dimension to what we've experienced in this last hour and a half.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you,
Thank you all for
Rebecca.
joining
Thank
us.
you, Sarah.
Thank you, Christina and Sarah. Thank you, everyone, for all your love.